Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 23, Episode 8, Samurai, Part 1. This episode was written by Trevor Absalom. As a child, Trevor became deeply interested in military history. He continued to be an avid reader and collector of militaria through his teenage years, before earning a commission as an infantry officer with the Canadian Scottish Regiment. In the early 1990s, he travelled to Japan working as an educator. This included a brief stint teaching for the Japanese self-defense forces. Whilst living in Japan, he became interested in the samurai. Focusing on collecting their armour, he studied under some of the most renowned experts in Japan at that time. Trevor also became a participant in the Soma no Moe, or the Soma Wild Horse Chase, the oldest authentic samurai festival still held in Japan, where he became the first non-Japanese national to ever earn a command rank in this prestigious Japanese government-designated important cultural event, which dates back to the 10th century. Trevor's personal knowledge and collection of armour ultimately saw him open his own business, where he specialised in the sale of authentic items of samurai armour, a large number of which can now be found in national, major museum and private collections around the world. Trevor has published 3 books on samurai armour and produced a documentary which aired on the Discovery Channel. His latest book, Samurai Armour, is published by Osprey. It is the first in a 2-part series and focuses on the forms of cuirass that the samurai utilised over the centuries. You can find a link to the book on our website, thehistorynetwork.org. The term samurai is a word that is almost universally recognised around the world. This is somewhat unusual for a historically based word, particularly for one that traces its origins back to a culture as unique as 10th century Japan. The image conjured by the term samurai for most people is that of a fierce, sword-wielding warrior, and while somewhat cliché, is not entirely incorrect. And yet, for a historical word and group that is so widely known, very few people really know anything else about these famed warrior figures of Japan's feudal past. Sadly, a considerable portion of the more readily available information about the samurai floating around society and online is for the most part inaccurate, and the byproduct of over a century worth of cultural misunderstandings, myths and Hollywood-like levels of historical misrepresentation. Even simple questions as to who the samurai were and where they came from is a debate that is for the most part overlooked, as is the question regarding their final demise. For while the samurai continued to dominate Japanese society up until the late 1860s, as they had for the better part of a millennium, by the early 1870s they no longer existed. This podcast will attempt to address the first of these 2 very basic, though highly complex questions, by focusing on the largely unknown historical origins of the samurai. In order to achieve this, we must go back in time to around 40,000 years ago, when the first humans began to migrate into the chain of some 6,852 islands off the east coast of the continental mainland of Asia, that we now recognise as forming the modern-day nation-state of Japan. These early arrivals appear to have been followed over the course of many tens of thousands of years by several separate waves of a post-Mongoloid-like people with Southeast Asian genetic characteristics who entered the Japanese archipelago by different directions, some coming from the north via the land bridge that the Kuril Islands then formed, while others came from the south through the Ryukyu chain of islands. Collectively, these people came to be known as the Jomon, a name that is derived from the distinctive style of pottery that they made, which featured decorative impressions on them that were made using ropes. Primarily hunter-gatherers, the Jomon peoples slowly became semi-sedentary as they learned to cultivate plants such as rice. The Jomon population appears to have peaked about 3000 to 2000 BC before it declined sharply. Climatic changes may have accounted for the initial decline in the population, as it upset the fragile balance of the Jomon's semi-sedentary lifestyle. While devastating, it was the arrival of a new race of peoples with Northeast Asian characteristics into the archipelago from the Korean peninsula via the southern Japanese island of Kyushu around the middle of the first millennium BC that proved to be the biggest threat to the survival of the Jomon. These new peoples and their culture came to be known as the Yayoi, after the district in Tokyo where archaeologists first discovered remnants of the distinctive forms of pottery that they utilized. The Yayoi's superior level of knowledge in agriculture and metallurgy allowed them to quickly establish themselves in the archipelago, for unlike the Jomon, the Yayoi were well versed in the continental practice of wet rice farming, which allowed them to establish strong permanent communities. Their metallurgical knowledge was instrumental in this endeavour, for it allowed them to fabricate strong tools and weapons from bronze, and in later centuries iron, that helped them to develop and defend their lands. The Jomon appeared to have coexisted with the Yayoi during the first half of the Yayoi period that was named after the latter. This dates from around the middle of the first millennium BC until approximately 250 AD. However, as the Yayoi population grew, both naturally and as the result of further waves of migration, tensions and then conflict erupted between the two cultures as the Yayoi pushed ever further into Jomon territories in an effort to secure additional tracts of agricultural land. Though the various Yayoi tribes collectively controlled a considerable portion of the main southern island areas of the Japanese archipelago by the time the first Chinese references to them began to appear in the 1st century CE, they were far from a unified society. The fragmented nature of Yayoi culture was documented in the Book of Han from the 24 histories, in which the Chinese referred to the Yayoi as the people who lived in the land that was divided into 100 tribes. The large number of small independent tribes noted by the Chinese gradually declined over the course of the 1st and 2nd century AD, which was a period of intense intertribal conflict amongst the Yayoi, with the most powerful clans merging into strong strategic alliances that allowed them to absorb the smaller tribes whom they defeated, while they simultaneously continued to engage and pursued the Jomon peoples that they encountered along the continually expanding frontiers of their territory. By the late 2nd century, the level of intertribal warfare between the Yayoi tribes had waned as the concept of a common identity began to emerge under the reign of a shaman priestess, Queen Himiko, from the powerful Yamataikoku. While a skilled ruler, the length of her reign clearly played a major role in the unification of the Yayoi tribes, for she is believed to have ruled for more than half a century, with some sources suggesting that she may have ruled for as long as 68 years. The power vacuum left in the wake of Queen Himiko's death in the middle of the 3rd century AD initially resulted in fighting amongst some of the most powerful of the Yayoi tribes as they jockeyed for positions of power within the evolving state structure. While brief, these intense disputes were ultimately resolved, with the tribes coming together to form a loose confederacy that came to be known as Yamato. A hugely significant event in the evolutionary path towards the development of the samurai class occurred during the latter part of the 4th century, when Yamato began to establish a cultural and economic relationship with the various kingdoms on the Korean peninsula, with whom they seem to have shared some ancestral links. Of these, a particularly strong relationship developed between Yamato and the southern Korean peninsula kingdom of Paekchi. While the relationship was mutually beneficial, Yamato was clearly the junior partner, and it eagerly attempted to absorb Paekchi's vastly superior levels of knowledge and technology. The Korean kingdom was content to share this information in order to establish an ally, for Paekchi was almost continuously at war during this time period with one or more of other major states on the Korean peninsula, namely the Goryeo and Silla, and the latter's extremely powerful, though on-again, off-again, Tang Dynasty Chinese allies. Massive cultural and technological advances swept across Yamato by the end of the 4th century as a result of their alliance with the Paekchi, as skilled craftsmen and other specialist immigrants from the Korean kingdom poured into the archipelago at the request of Yamato. These included artists and engineers, metal workers, potters, priests and scholars. Paekchi princes and princesses also began to appear within the Yamato court, which resulted in the introduction of the Chinese writing system, Confucian studies, and in later centuries the introduction of the Buddhist faith into the fledgling Japanese court and lands of Yamato. The cultural flowering that occurred as a result of these influences marked the beginning of a new era that came to be known as the Asuka Period, circa 552 to 645 AD, which is synonymous in Japanese history as an era of advanced architectural designs and the development of the fine arts. From the standpoint of the future evolution of the Japanese warrior class, Yamato's relationship with the Korean peninsula was a critical one, for it introduced the Yamato warriors to the concept of the mounted warrior, which, irrespective of the fact that it had been practiced on the continental mainland for several centuries, had hitherto been unknown within the archipelago. They were likewise introduced to the equestrian skills and horse furnishings that went hand in hand with this unique method of fighting. Complementing this knowledge was an introduction to the styles of lamellar armour that their Paekchi allies utilized, which differed significantly from the rigid forms of cuirass that had traditionally been used by the Yayoi, that, while effective, were poorly suited for use by mounted warriors. Irrespective of Yamato's strong bond and alliance with Paekchi, it continued to court the development of diplomatic and economic relationships with the other kingdoms on the Korean peninsula. These efforts may have been kept somewhat in check, however, by the growing presence of a large number of expatriate members of the Paekchi nobility within the Yamato court, who maintained a strong sense of allegiance with their homeland. Yamato's confused and often contradictory position towards the other Korean kingdoms was reflected in the fact that while it periodically sent troops to help its Paekchi ally fight their enemies on the peninsula, it was also dispatching embassies throughout the 6th and 7th century to China and the enemy kingdoms of its ally. One of the most successful of these missions spent 20 years amongst the Tang court before returning to Yamato. The vast array of information and ideas that returned to Japan with this embassy, particularly in the area of socio-economic reforms, would go on to play a significant role in the evolving identity of Japan, the imperial court, and the future rise of the samurai class. Many of these ideas were eventually codified in the Taika reforms that were introduced by Emperor Kotoku in 645 AD. One of the more significant edicts established by the Taika reforms was the creation of a national army that mirrored the formations of the Tang Dynasty Chinese armies in its structure and organization. This new force was to be sustained by a national draft and was to be equipped and trained in the style of the Tang Chinese forces. This move by Yamato seems to have been a fight fire with fire effort, for they appear to have come to the conclusion that it was only a matter of time before their Paekchi ally would be defeated by the Tang Dynasty-backed armies from Silla. And when that day came, Yamato realized that they were almost certainly going to have to answer for having taken up arms over the centuries alongside Paekchi. This epiphany on the part of Yamato may have contributed to their slow and ultimately failed effort to send troops to Paekche to save the embattled kingdom, which fell to Silla and Tang dynasty troops in 660 AD. While Yamato may have suspected that Paekche would be defeated, its demise appears to have surprised the court in Yamato, which belatedly rallied in support of its fallen ally. It did so by organising a massive expeditionary force, supposedly comprising of some 37,000 of its new model army troops between 661 and 662 AD, with the goal of liberating and resurrecting the kingdom of their fallen Paekche allies. Yamato's knee-jerk decision to invade the peninsula may have been influenced by the flood of Paekche nobles who arrived in the Yamato court ahead of the tidal wave of refugees who poured into the archipelago to escape the ravages of their long-standing enemies' harsh occupation of their homeland. The new model Yamato army, spurred on by ancestral and political loyalties, was, however, no match for the combined force of Tang dynasty Chinese and Silla troops, who virtually annihilated the expeditionary force from Yamato at the Battle of Hakusukanoi in 663. The defeat at Hakusukanoi was a game-changer for Yamato and another of the pivotal moments in the future evolution of the samurai, for Yamato was now on its own and weak from the devastating defeat of its army, which left it exposed to possible invasion by a huge and irritated enemy force that was only a couple of days' sea journey away from their coast. Adding to this burden was the huge number of Paekche refugees, the majority of whom no longer brought skills or knowledge with them that did not already exist in Yamato. This undermined their ability to be able to take care of themselves, while it also damaged the economy of the communities that they huddled around. The stress on Yamato's society caused by the refugees became a source of considerable concern for the court, which recognized the substantial potential for civil unrest that this large number of displaced and largely unwanted people represented. The court's answer to this problem was to push the majority of the refugees toward the frontier regions along the eastern outskirts of the domain that is now referred to as the Kanto Plain, a massive 17,000 square kilometre plateau that incorporates the geographical areas of the modern-day prefectures of Chiba, Gunma, Kanagawa, Saitama, Tochigi, and the Tokyo metropolis. While this subtly enforced exodus was important to the future expansion of the frontiers of Yamato, it also contributed to the development of the samurai, for a large number of former mounted Paekche warriors are believed to have been amongst the refugees that were directed towards the east, an area that by happenstance was also ideally suited to horses, and that in later centuries would give rise to several households of equestrian warriors who would feature prominently in Japanese history. Having failed to liberate their homeland, the quasi-Paekche Yamato court scrambled to build a series of defensive forts along the coast of the Kyushu to fend off a retaliatory Tang Chinese and Silla invasion. So certain was Yamato that it would be next on the chopping block that the court began a concerted effort to disassociate themselves from their fallen ally. They did this by commissioning a history of the archipelago and its people that expunged the past and nullified any connection or influence from the continent. Through plausible deniability, they hoped that they could stave off the aggressive intentions of the Silla and their powerful Tang allies. This effort can clearly be observed in the legitimatory Kojiki and Nihon Shoki texts, which saw the key families amongst the Yamato court rebranded with spotless new domestic lineages that could be traced back to the first emperor of what was to become Japan, the mythical 8th century BC Jimmu, who himself was proclaimed to be a direct descendant of one of the main Japanese creation myth deities, Amaterasu. These same fables were also used to establish the Japanese as a distinct peoples, unique unto themselves, whose achievements and knowledge were entirely homogeneous and devoid of outside influence. The huge and bewildering gaps that were left in the expunged historical record were patched over with a series of carefully conceived legends and mythical creation stories that conveniently ignored the vast contributions that China and Korea had made towards the advancement of society in the hitherto state of Yamato, with the new emerged Japanese peoples reassigning credit for every cultural, social and technological achievement that had occurred within Japan to themselves. It is ironic to note, however, that while Yamato laboured to officially disassociate themselves from their past and any signs of foreigner cultural influences, the evolving Japanese state became increasingly more Tang Dynasty-like in form and organisation. For the rebranded Japanese court was anxious to strengthen the country, which they did in part by uniting it under the control of a strong central government with an emperor at its head. In 702, the Taiho Code was introduced, which divided the government into an administrative and religious section like that of Tang Dynasty Chinese. More important, however, to the ultimate rise of the samurai was the court's program of land redistribution, which made all lands the property of the imperial household. Thus, even the domains of some of the oldest and strongest Yamato clans were forfeited to the state and redistributed as provinces or kuni, each of which was under the control of a governor, who were known as kami. To compensate some of the powerful families who were affected by this reorganization, as well as to provide the nobility and the temples with a means of income, the court established shoun, or private landholdings. These were distributed amongst the aforementioned groups, as well as to those who earned favour with the court through military or political service. Everything within the boundaries of a shoun became the property of the governor, to whom the landholding was assigned, and whose control over the landholding was absolute. Fundamentally tax-free havens, the shoun were also entirely independent of the court and were under the exclusive jurisdiction of the entity who controlled the land grant, which made them the ideal breeding grounds for the embryonic seeds of the Japanese warrior class. For the most part, the majority of the kami were junior members of the Imperial Lineage. As the third, fourth and fifth sons of nobility, they were unable to secure duties within the court, and as such had no prospects for advancement. In an effort to diffuse and disperse the growing number of these frustrated and superfluous young nobles, they were bestowed with the Imperial Lineage surnames of the Minamoto or Taira, formerly disinherited and then dispatched to the fringes of the imperial domain to govern shoun in the frontier provinces. While many young nobles floundered in their posts for lack of experience or interest, preferring to rely on local authorities to administer their domains, others flourished. Free from the restrictive trappings of court life, they generally took an avid and sincere interest in the development of the shoun they controlled, most of which prospered, secluded and undisturbed as they were by the increasingly irrelevant edicts that were being conceived by the far-off court. One of the byproducts of the court's policy of sending its young and superfluous nobles to the frontier regions was that it forced the continued expansion of the frontier to create new shoun for the seemingly endless number of displaced members of the nobility and their followers. This sparked a renewed and vicious series of conflicts with the indigenous Jomon inhabitants, but things had changed since the 4th century, when the Japanese had last made major pushes into Jomon territory. For the people that the Japanese encountered along the frontier at the end of the 7th and early 8th century were far more capable of resisting their intrusions, and did so with considerable success. Several factors had empowered the rise of these post-Jomon-like peoples, but none more so than the introduction of the horse and equestrian knowledge from the continent. For the horse was ideally suited to their needs as quasi-nomadic hunter-gatherers, and though a breed of small horse appears to have been indigenous to the Japanese archipelago, there is no evidence to suggest that the Jomon or Yayoi ever made use of domesticated horses for any purpose until the larger and stronger Mongolian breeds of horses that were utilized by their Korean counterparts were introduced into the archipelago. This knowledge gradually reached the Jomon peoples who lived along the fringes of frontier regions of Yamato, for the majority of Yamato communities would have included a considerable number of Jomon people who had willingly merged with Yamato society. Such individuals would have been conduits for interaction with their families and former community. In their general isolation, trade would have also occurred to the mutual benefit of these two cultural groups. The passing of equestrian knowledge to the Jomon, however, would ultimately prove to be a bad deal for the future Japanese, for the Jomon were quick to embrace and master the art of equestrianism. Their skill in this area was in large part due to their much greater reliance on the horse to sustain themselves than was generally the case with their more sophisticated neighbours. Thus, by the time Japan's 3-century-long period of interaction with the Korean peninsula had come to an end in the mid-7th century, the post-Jomon peoples along the frontier were a far more advanced and capable people than they had been at the end of the 4th century. They had been able to achieve these changes in part from having absorbed the technological advancements made within Yamato that were useful to them, and by the fact that they had generally been left in peace throughout Yamato's long period of infatuation with the Korean peninsula. And while these Japanese peoples along the frontier were more than likely well aware of the increased abilities of their post-Jomon neighbours, the distant court and the rest of the population within the Japanese part of the archipelago were not. Thus the court was shocked when their vastly larger new model Chinese-style Japanese army units of conscript troops were routed again and again by the post-Jomon forces they engaged along the frontier with. This was largely due to the fact that the Japanese troops were wholly unprepared for the foe they were confronting, the latter of whom relied heavily on ambushes and hit-and-run tactics to pick off and wear down their opponents. They had the ability to gather together like ants and just as quickly disperse like birds, as the renowned Japanese historian George Sanson wrote. This skill set enabled the post-Jomon warriors to take on and defeat forces that were much larger than themselves. Their ability to successfully repel the Japanese troops was in large part due to the fact that the majority of post-Jomon warriors fought as mounted archers who could race in and dispatch the mostly foot-borne and spear-carrying Japanese troops they encountered at a safe distance before reeling away and vanishing into the surrounding forests. So effective were the post-Jomon warriors that even official imperial court documents noted how just one of these mounted archers was capable of defeating 10 Japanese conscript troops. The exceptional ability of the post-Jomon as mounted archers was a byproduct of their hunter-gatherer lifestyle, which by necessity had honed their skill with a bow. Their talent in this regard appears to have been reflected in a new word that the Japanese began to use for these post-Jomon peoples around this time period, who they started to refer to as the emishi. While this term is commonly translated to mean barbarian peoples, it is also possible that its actual origin may have stemmed from the Japanese word yumishi, or bowman. Whatever the origin of the word, the emishi were a formidable and deadly opponent. Their mounted archery skills, which as hunter-gatherers were highly efficient, in combination with their intimate knowledge of their territories, allowed them to attack and then quickly disperse into the dark recesses of the countryside, where, unlike their antagonist, they were able to find comfort, shelter, and sustenance. While the fighting skill and tenacity of the emishi helped them resist the Japanese, they were also significantly assisted in their endeavours by a number of major flaws within the concept of the Chinese-style conscript army that the court in Yamato had introduced in the 7th century. Join us in a couple of weeks' time for the second part of this fascinating look at the samurai. You've been listening to The History Network, written by Trevor Absalom, read by Nick Barker.